Here are some O'Carroll discoveries from June of 2014 dealing with my great-great-grandfather Joseph O'Carroll, who in 1883 turned up in San Francisco. And this was the last we had heard of him. And you can see on the back of the photograph it has his name, Joseph O'Carroll, and what later emerges as Turk Street, San Francisco, December 1883. Now, we never knew what he was doing in San Francisco in 1883, and we still don't really. What was he doing there? That was the last we heard of him. We didn't know if he was buried in Dublin, if he was buried in San Francisco, or what actually happened to him, because we don't have a date of death for him, and we don't have any burial records either. So the Joseph O'Carroll ran a pawn shop, in fact a series of pawn shops, and here you see the O'Carroll pawn shop in Great Britain Street, 30.5 to 31.5 Great Britain Street, and on the side of the building we can see that it says O'Carroll's, the cheapest and best house in city for boots, clothing and other miscellaneous articles. And then there's a flag over the balcony which may be held by this mysterious man that's standing there in his bowler hat. And then there's a variety of clothes and clothing, bric-a-brac, suitcases and trunks, and probably Maria Jane Dockery, who marries Joseph O'Carroll, the wife, standing in the front door with Joseph O'Carroll possibly to her left with a stick in his hand that he would use for getting the various clothing down from where they were hanging. And then there's a variety of other people as well. These may very well be employees. Some of the younger ones may actually be members of the O'Carroll family. Perhaps a young James Joseph O'Carroll standing there with one of his sisters. Now, the O'Carrolls came from a long line of pawnbrokers. We had Thomas Carroll, born in 1805, then his son Joseph O'Carroll, born around about 1835 or so, and then Hugh Thomas O'Carroll, my great-grandfather, born around about 1867. But the O'Carroll family, which consisted of the 2 boys and the 6 girls, was beset by tragedy. Elizabeth O'Carroll died in May 1880, aged 1, followed a month later by her sister Anne, aged 6, and then 4 years later Mary Jane O'Carroll died at the age of 11, Francie died at the age of 19, and finally Kate O'Carroll died at the age of 31, a few years after she was married. So this left, on top of that, of course, Joseph O'Carroll himself became bankrupt in 1880, so it was not an easy time for the O'Carroll clan. Of the children, 4 of them had children themselves. So Hugh Thomas O'Carroll had a whole rake of daughters and 2 sons. Margaret Mary Doughty O'Carroll married James Patrick Kerrigan and had 2 sons, James Joseph and Hugh Alphonsus Kerrigan. Kate married Thomas Sheridan and had, we believe, 2 children, but we haven't been able to locate them or their descendants at this point. And then the youngest son, the mysterious youngest son, who we never found until last year when Michael Kerrigan found him on Ancestry and managed to get in touch with his granddaughter. So Joseph James O'Carroll, the youngest son, also known as James Joseph O'Carroll, married Maria Theresa Knox, and they had 2 children, James Frederick Carroll and Helen Mary O'Carroll, who unfortunately died at the age of 20 of heart complaints. Now, I was in San Francisco relatively recently, and I knew that this is where the younger son was buried, James Joseph O'Carroll, along with his wife and their 20-year-old daughter. So I went along to Holy Cross Cemetery in Colma, which is just south of San Francisco, and I went looking for their graves. Now, I found the grave of James Joseph Carroll, who is the youngest son of Joseph O'Carroll, and he's buried with a Joseph Gibney. Now, Gibney is also a name from our family tree, so I'm waiting to hear from the genealogist at the Holy Cross Cemetery to see if she can find anything in the burial register to throw a little bit of light on who this Joseph Gibney is. I also found the wife of James Joseph Carroll, Mary T. Clifton. She married again after he passed away to a chap called Clifton. And I also found buried with her her daughter, Helen M. Carroll, who died at the age of 20 of heart trouble. I also asked on the off chance if they had a grave for a Joseph O. Carroll, because we didn't know if he died in Dublin or San Francisco, and they said they only had one Joseph O. Carroll in the graveyard, and he died in 1895. But he's buried with a James Carroll, who died the previous year in 1894. And I thought, well, no, they're probably not ours. But who are they? Maybe brothers or something? So I went to look for the individual graves, and I found the site of the grave of James J. Carroll, but there is no headstone there for him. And I also found the grave of his wife and their daughter, Helen, and there is a headstone there for those two individuals, and you can see it there. I also found the grave of Joseph O. Carroll and James Carroll, but there's nothing written on the gravestone about Joseph O. Carroll. There's the name James Carroll, but that is all. There's no inscription and no further information. And it's quite an expensive looking headstone, because there's a cross, there is tiles, and there's two nice little flower pots on either side of the grave. But there's no further information there. And they were buried in 1895, the 30th of August 1895, and the 20th of June 1894. So I next went to the newspapers, and I was able to find the death notices for these two latter Carrolls. Joseph O. Carroll, buried on the 30th of August, along with a newspaper report on the 30th of August announcing the day of the funeral. And he was aged 60, and he was late of Dublin. So that was an interesting find and quite coincidental. And it ties in with the burial of the Joseph O. Carroll in the cemetery in Colma. I also found the death notice for the James Carroll, who was buried in the cemetery in Colma, and again, it is on exactly the same day that the burial is registered in the cemetery. And he died in the sanitarium in San Jose on June the 18th. He was a native of Ireland, and he was aged 63, 3 years older than Joseph O. Carroll. So perhaps he was an older brother. So I found out then a little bit more about this James Carroll in a newspaper article from 3 days following his burial. And that revealed that James Carroll was a wealthy bachelor capitalist who died at St. Mary's Hospital, the sanitarium, on June the 16th. So there's a little difference there in the dates. But it estimated that his estate was worth $250,000, which back in those days would be worth millions now. And it consists of a lot on Laguna Street, 200 shares of stock in the San Francisco Laundry, and after payment of specific bequests, the residue of the estate, amounting to over $100,000, is to become the property of Archbishop Riordan, the Catholic Archbishop of San Francisco. Not only that, but the deceased left $5,000 to each of the following relatives: Joseph A. Carroll, a brother, Carroll's wife and his two sons, Hugh and James J., his daughters Margaret M., Catherine J., and Frances Carroll. These are the people that we know of in Joseph O. Carroll's family. This is our Joseph O. Carroll. The newspaper then goes on to say that he leaves bequests to Bedelia Malone, a sister, her husband, and her sons Elias, Patrick, Thomas, Francis, and Joseph. So it's quite clear that this James and our Joseph were brothers, and they had a sister, Bedelia. It also goes on to describe the various charities to which James bequeathed money, including my personal favourite, the Old Ladies' Home for Aged and Infirm Females. So that was a very interesting find. And he's also mentioned in another newspaper article from the 23rd of June in another San Francisco paper, and in this one it says that he bequeaths $5,000 to his brother Joseph O. Carroll, a resident of Ireland, $5,000 to Joseph's wife Maria, so that must be Maria Jane Dockery, Maria O'Carroll, his wife, and $5,000 each to each of their children, Hugh, Margaret, Catherine, Francis, and James J. O'Carroll. And the children are in order of their age. A similar sum is bequeathed to the testator's sister, Bedelia Malone, and to her husband, Patrick. So now we have the name of Bedelia's husband, Patrick, and to each of their 6 sons. So they have 6 sons in this newspaper report compared to the 5 sons in the previous one. Well, this means that the family tree of Joseph O'Carroll has now been expanded considerably. Not only does he have a brother, James, but he also has a sister, Bedelia, who married a Patrick Malone. And they have 5 sons at least, of whom we know the names, and an additional 6th son of whom we don't know the name. So we now have an Uncle James and an Auntie Bedelia. Whatever happened to Bedelia Malone? That's a fascinating question that will need to be explored. We know what happened to James Carroll. He was the wealthy capitalist bachelor who died and left a fortune to Archbishop Riordan of San Francisco. And we have some tantalizing clues about what happened to Joseph O'Carroll. But can we find out more? Well, if we look at the newspaper articles regarding James Carroll and the obituary that was written about him, it says, "Sudden end of a prominent capitalist. His death a surprise to his friends. Interesting career of an enterprising and ambitious Irish lad." And it goes on to tell us that James Carroll, a well-known capitalist of this city, died Sunday evening after a short illness at Monterey, where he went in search of rest and quiet during the early part of last week. A short time ago he was stricken down for a while, all hopes of his recovery were abandoned, and after careful treatment in St. Mary's Hospital, which must be the sanitarium, he sufficiently recovered his strength to be able to get about with ease. But he then suffered a series of strokes, and that left him ill and unable to carry on work. He was born in Ireland, it says, 63 years ago, so this ties in with the death notice, which said he was 63 years old. He has several blood relations still living there. He left his native land at the age of 17, came to the United States, spent some time on the eastern seaboard, and then made his way to St. Louis and then on to the far west, where he founded a laundry in San Francisco, the San Francisco Laundry, with his business partner S.F. Bufford. Mr. Bufford continued to manage the general business, while Mr. Carroll devoted his time to the running of the laundry proper. After his retirement, Mr. Carroll spent a lot of his time speculating rather extensively in real estate. And during the past 6 years, the deceased suffered from a severe attack of deafness and was unable to hold a conversation without the aid of a speaking trumpet. He was related to Tom Carroll of the Bostonians. Who was Tom Carroll? Was he a first cousin, a second cousin, something else? So the obituary gives us a lot of very interesting information about James Carroll, the wealthy bachelor capitalist. Tom Carroll, on the other hand, was born Thomas O'Carroll in Dublin. And he was a tenor and a performer and manager of the Bostonians, which was one of the premier light opera companies of America during the 1890s. He died in Rochester, New York in 1916, and there is a biography of him in the Encyclopedia Biography, including some very interesting facts. The fact that he never married either, just like his cousin, James, but maintained a home in Rochester on Prince Street, presided over by Mr. Delon M. Dewey and his sister, Miss Margaret Carroll, who, after residing 36 years in Australia, came to the United States in 1902 to be with her famous and well-beloved brother. The only other inmate of that home was his lifetime friend and 40 years business manager, Delon M. Dewey. The bachelors were devoted to each other, and the home they occupied was filled with curios and works of art gathered by Mr. Carroll from all parts of the world, not as souvenirs, but with the discriminating taste of the artist and scholar. Another piece of information from his biography: Tom Carroll was born in Dublin, Ireland, January the 19th, 1842, and died at his home, number 51 Prince Street, Rochester, New York, March the 19th, 1916. So we have a date of birth for Tom Carroll. We know he had a sister, Margaret, who spent 36 years in Australia. The question is, can we trace Tom and his sister Margaret back to Dublin? Another tantalizing question raised by these findings. Well, going back to San Francisco and to the register of voters, we find that in 1882, James Carroll, the wealthy bachelor capitalist who set up a laundry, was living on the northwest corner of Turk Street and Fillmore Street. And, of course, Turk Street was written on the back of the photograph from 1883. So this is again another piece of information that ties James Carroll to Joseph O. Carroll. Similarly, in 1886, James Carroll, again, he comes from Ireland. His occupation is laundry, and this time he's living at 1518 Eddy Street, which is just behind Turk Street. Now, James Carroll died in June 1894. In October 1894, an Irish representative reaches this city. Patrick T. Malone of Queen's County, Ireland, is a guest of the American Exchange. Mr. Malone's visit is in connection with the estate of the late James Carroll of this city. Mr. Malone's wife was a sister of Mr. Carroll. That must be Bedelia Malone. There is a brother, Patrick O'Carroll of Dublin. Now, they probably got Joseph wrong. It should be Joseph O'Carroll of Dublin. And the two are nearest of kin to the late Mr. Carroll. Well, then that has to be Joseph. Then there's a little brief resume about James Carroll. They get the amount of the bequest to Mr. Malone and Mr. O'Carroll incorrect. They say it's $52,000, when in actual fact the previous newspaper article said it was $5,000 each. Apparently, a legal firm in this city wrote to the Irish heirs offering to contest the will. They advised them that the will could be easily broken and desired as a retaining fee £800, or about $4,000 in United States money. That's a very different exchange rate to what we have now. Subsequently, they wrote offering to take the case on a contingent fee. In speaking of this matter yesterday, Mr. Malone declared that the heirs would not contest the will. They did not desire to do so, and that all they asked was the bequests made in the will. They did not propose that attorneys should violate the dead man's wishes or divide his estate with legal charges. Mr. Malone will remain in San Francisco some weeks. So it seemed that everything was in order, that Patrick T. Malone, Bedelia's husband and brother-in-law of James, had come over to San Francisco to take care of the will and to tie up loose ends. And that was October 1894, but a lot can happen in the space of 2 months. And in December 1894, on the front page of the New York Times, Joseph O'Carroll of Dublin, Ireland, today began a contest of the will of his brother James, who died in this city, San Francisco, leaving an estate valued at $250,000, over $100,000 of which was bequeathed to Archbishop Riordan. The contestant and each member of his family were left small legacies. And it not only hit the front page of the New York Times, but the Kansas City Star, the Indiana Democrat, the Salt Lake Tribune, and the San Francisco Chronicle, all in December 1894. Well, was the contest successful? It doesn't look that way. In May 1895, 5 months after the contest began, leave was asked to sell the realty of James Carroll by the Union Trust Company, executors of the will of James Carroll. So they petitioned the courts to actually sell some of the properties, and then in July, 2 months later, an auction was announced for Thursday, August the 8th, where a variety of different properties of James Carroll were to be sold. Well, on August the 30th, Joseph O'Carroll dies and is buried in the grave with James Carroll. But the question is the Joseph O'Carroll in the grave in San Francisco our Joseph O'Carroll, late of Dublin, who came over to challenge the will? That's the question that remains to be answered. Is the Joseph O'Carroll in the cemetery our Joseph? How did he die? How did he get there? Whatever happened to Bedelia Malone? Can we trace Tom and Margaret Carroll back to Dublin, and in so doing find a connection between them and our O'Carrolls? And can we go even further back than that? Can we trace the roots of the O'Carroll family back in time to Laois, to Offaly, to Roscommon? These and other tantalizing questions can only be answered if you tune in next week for another exciting adventure. Thank you and good night.